In the quiet village of Xiangkou, nestled in the mountains of Guangdong province, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. Farmers worked the fields from dawn until dusk, and villagers shared simple meals under the shade of trees in the town square. Among them was a young woman named Xu Lan, known for her beauty and grace. A rare flower in a land hardened by poverty, but beauty alone would not be enough to shield her from the tragic fate that awaited her. Born into a humble farming family, Xu Lan's life had always been a struggle. Her father, a hard-working but aging farmer, labored in the fields while her mother sold vegetables in the village market. They barely made enough to survive, relying on the unpredictable weather and harvests that came each year. The family owned only a small plot of land, and Xu Lan often joined her parents, her hands blistered from pulling weeds and carrying heavy baskets of produce to market. As the only daughter, Xu Lan was the pride of her family. Though her life was hard, she carried herself with dignity, her long black hair falling like silk down her back, and her porcelain skin glowing in the sun. Her eyes, deep and knowing, held within them the wisdom of someone who had seen too much suffering, but still hoped for a better life. When Xu Lan was a teenager, her beauty attracted the attention of many young men in the village, but her heart was already taken by Bo Jing, a kind and gentle young man who also came from a poor family. Bo Jing worked in the fields beside his father, and although they had little, they were content. Xu Lan and Bo Jing's love grew in the quiet moments they shared, whether it was exchanging glances while working in the fields or sneaking away to a hidden spot by the river, where they dreamt of a future that seemed always just out of reach. Bo Jing was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any declaration of love. Every day, he would find small ways to make Xu Lan smile, picking wildflowers on his way home from the fields, carving small wooden figurines, or catching fireflies for her in a jar. They didn't need wealth to feel rich, for they had each other. However, the harsh reality of their circumstances loomed over them, a constant reminder that love alone might not be enough to secure their future. As Xu Lan approached her 23rd birthday, the pressure on her family began to mount. Her father, weakened by years of backbreaking labor, could no longer work as he once had. The family's debts grew, and the crop yields were unpredictable, further deepening their financial woes. Xu Lan's mother began to grow anxious, seeing marriage as the only way out of their poverty. In their village, marriage wasn't just a union of two souls, but often a transactional agreement, where families exchanged dowries and secured alliances to improve their social standing. When a proposal arrived from the wealthy Zhou family in Foshan, it seemed like a blessing. The Zhou family owned several businesses in the bustling town and were known for their vast wealth and connections. The son, Zhou Ming, was their only heir, and while rumors about his mental state swirled in the village, the dowry they offered was far too tempting for Xu Lan's family to refuse. The money promised would not only pay off their debts, but also ensure that Xu Lan's younger siblings would have a better life. Xu Lan was devastated. She knew that her heart belonged to Bo Jing, but her family's financial situation left her with little choice. Her parents, though loving, made it clear that this was the only way to secure their future. Her protests were met with silence, her tears ignored. The night before her wedding, she slipped away under the cover of darkness, desperate to see Bo Jing one last time. They met in their secret spot by the river, the moon casting long shadows on the water. Bo Jing held Xu Lan's trembling hands as they stood in silence, the weight of their unspoken words too much to bear. Xu Lan wept softly, her tears falling into the river as she leaned into Bo Jing's arms, knowing that this would be the last time they would ever be together. "I don't want to leave you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," Bo Jing replied, his own heart shattering. "But you have to. I can't give you what they can. I can't save you from this." They spent the night together by the river, clinging to each other in a desperate attempt to hold on to the love that was slipping away. But when the first light of dawn broke, Xu Lan knew she had to leave. She kissed Bo Jing one last time before turning away, her footsteps heavy as she walked toward her future, a future she didn't want. The wedding was a lavish affair, with the Zhou family sparing no expense. Xu Lan was adorned in a traditional red wedding dress, her face covered by a veil as she was led to her new husband. Zhou Ming was a man of few words, and it quickly became apparent to Xu Lan that he was not capable of being a husband in any meaningful sense. He was mentally disabled, his actions childlike and erratic, and Xu Lan's heart sank as she realized the true nature of the life she had been forced into. But Zhou Ming was not the true threat in the household. It was his father, Zhou Jian, who wielded the real power. Zhou Jian was a ruthless businessman, known for his temper and violent tendencies. His wife Ling had long since learned to endure his cruelty in silence, and Xu Lan soon found herself the target of his lecherous advances. At first, Zhou Jian attempted to woo Xu Lan with sweet words, trying to charm her into submission. He complimented her beauty, bought her expensive gifts, and tried to lure her into his private quarters under the pretense of teaching her about the family business. But Xu Lan, sensing danger, kept her distance, always finding an excuse to avoid being alone with him. As the weeks passed, Zhou Jian grew frustrated with Xu Lan's resistance. His advances became more aggressive, and one night, when the rest of the household was asleep, he forced his way into Xu Lan's room. She tried to fight him off, but Zhou Jian was much stronger, and he overpowered her easily. After that night, Xu Lan's life became a living nightmare. Zhou Jian no longer bothered with pretense. He would force himself on her whenever he pleased, and Xu Lan was powerless to stop him. Xu Lan's days were filled with humiliation and despair. Zhou Jian's wife, Ling, turned a blind eye to the abuse, too afraid of her husband to intervene. The servants whispered about the horrors happening behind closed doors, but no one dared to speak out. Xu Lan was trapped, with no one to turn to for help. Desperate to escape, Xu Lan wrote a letter to Bo Jing, telling him of the abuse she had endured. She begged him to help her, to find a way to free her from the nightmare she was living. Bo Jing, heartbroken and furious, agreed to meet her and help her escape. They planned her escape carefully, waiting for a night when Zhou Jian would be away on business, but their plan was doomed from the start. On the night they were set to flee, Zhou Jian returned home unexpectedly. Xu Lan was in the kitchen, packing what little she could take with her. When Zhou Jian stormed into the room, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip bruising her skin, and began to drag her toward the bedroom. But this time, Xu Lan was not alone. Bo Jing, hiding in the shadows, could no longer stay silent. He rushed at Zhou Jian, grabbing a nearby wooden stick and swinging it with all his strength. The blow struck Zhou Jian on the side of the head, and he collapsed to the ground, blood pooling around him. In the shock of the moment, Xu Lan and Bo Jing fled, running into the night, their hearts pounding with fear and adrenaline. But their freedom was short-lived. The murder was quickly discovered, and within hours, the police apprehended both Xu Lan and Bo Jing. At the trial, the details of Xu Lan's abuse were laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom was packed with villagers, journalists, and curious onlookers, all eager to hear the sordid details of the crime. Xu Lan testified about the months of torment she had endured at the hands of Zhou Jian, and Bo Jing admitted to killing him in a fit of rage after witnessing the assault. The judge, moved by the horror of Xu Lan's story, sentenced her to only 5 years in prison, recognizing the abuse she had suffered. Bo Jing, however, was sentenced to 12 years for murder, a punishment that weighed heavily on Xu Lan's heart. Though they had escaped Zhou Jian's cruelty, they were both still prisoners of their circumstances. As Xu Lan was led away in handcuffs, she looked back at Bo Jing, their eyes meeting one last time. They had once dreamt of a future together, but now that future was gone, buried under the weight of tragedy and violence. In the years that followed, Xu Lan's story became a symbol of the silent suffering endured by many women in rural China, trapped in abusive marriages with no way out. Her case sparked conversations about domestic violence and the need for greater protections for women in vulnerable situations. But for Xu Lan and Bo Jing, there would be no happy ending. Their love, once pure and full of promise, had been shattered by the cruelty of a world that cared more about money and power. Their love, once pure and full of promise, had been shattered by the cruelty of a world that cared more about money and power than about the lives of two young people who had only wanted to be free. Xu Lan's 5 years in prison were not easy. While her sentence was light compared to the severity of the crime, the emotional burden of what had happened weighed heavily on her. She spent her days in the women's prison in Guangdong, surrounded by women who had their own stories of pain and survival. Some had been thieves, others had been drug addicts, and some had suffered abuse much like her own. Though the prison was harsh, it was also a strange sort of refuge for Xu Lan. For the first time in years, she was away from Zhou Jian's cruelty and no longer had to fear for her life. But she could not stop thinking about Bo Jing, whose sacrifice had cost him much more than his freedom. He had killed for her, and now he sat in a distant prison, far from the life they had once imagined together. The guilt gnawed at Xu Lan, eating away at her every day. In prison, Xu Lan kept to herself. She wasn't interested in making friends or talking about her past. Instead, she spent her time learning to read and write better. Though Xu Lan had lost her freedom, her mind was her own, and through reading and learning, she found small ways to empower herself. She dreamed of a future outside the prison walls, where she could live quietly, perhaps working in a library or as a school teacher. Though her dreams of love with Bo Jing were gone, she clung to the idea that one day she could have a life of her own, a life not defined by the cruelty of Zhou Jian or the poverty that had once held her back. Meanwhile, Bo Jing's sentence weighed heavily on him. The prison where he was held was far less forgiving than Xu Lan's. His fellow prisoners were hardened criminals, many of them convicted of violent crimes. Bo Jing, though strong from years of farm work, was not prepared for the brutality of prison life. He kept his head down, avoiding conflict as best he could, but the weight of what he had done stayed with him. Bo Jing had always been a man of few words, but in prison, his silence deepened. He rarely spoke to the other inmates, and the guards paid him little attention. In his mind, he replayed the night he had killed Zhou Jian over and over. In those quiet moments before sleep, when the prison was still, Bo Jing would close his eyes and remember the dreams they had once shared. The small house by the river, the children they had hoped to raise together. But now, those dreams were gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of prison life. Despite the pain, Bo Jing found solace in knowing that Xu Lan was no longer in danger. He had saved her, even if it had cost him everything. In 2014, 5 years after her sentencing, Xu Lan was released from prison. Xu Lan returned to Xiangkou, but the village no longer felt like home. Her parents welcomed her back, but the once bustling village now felt empty. Many of her childhood friends had moved to the city, and the fields where she had once worked with Bo Jing were now overgrown and neglected. She knew she could not stay there. The memories were too painful, and the life she had once imagined was gone. As for Bo Jing, his release in 2021 was a quiet affair. He returned to Xiangkou, where he lived with his aging parents, helping them on the farm. The years in prison had changed him, just as they had changed Xu Lan. Though they no longer wrote to each other, they both carried the weight of their shared past, a bond that would never fully fade, even as their lives moved in different directions. In the end, Xu Lan and Bo Jing's story was not one of happy endings, but of survival. Xu Lan's life, though quiet, was a testament to resilience. She had not let the darkness of her past define her future. She had built a new life, one of her own choosing, and in that, she had found peace. And in the small, quiet moments of her life, when she sat alone in her apartment or walked through the crowded streets of Guangzhou, Xu Lan sometimes think of Bo Jing. She would remember the river where they had once dreamed together, the stars that had seemed so full of promise. And though those dreams had never come to pass, she would smile, knowing that they had once shared something beautiful, something that no amount of tragedy could ever truly erase.